I will try to live up to that generous introduction. Thank you. Those of you who are anthropologists will immediately recognize the allusion in my title. It's an allusion to Mary Douglas's How Institutions Think, which Mary Douglas's book was kind of a treatment of the problem of collective action and also something of a takedown of utilitarianism. And a year ago I had the opportunity to present some of these ideas at her old department at University College London, and since then I've been developing this, and one hopes it will evolve into a book over the next year. Okay. Problem is very simple. This is something I noticed a few years ago, and it's just been growing, that there's several works, such as Mansur Olson's The Logic of Collective Action, M.G. Smith's Corporations and Society, Robert Axelrod's The Complexity of Cooperation, Mary Douglas, as I mentioned, and Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner, Governing the Commons. All are talking about this same problem of collective action, how to deal with free riders, how to manage common pool resources. They're all talking about the same thing, but they're almost totally oblivious of each other. There's few. Olson's book is kind of foundational, so there's usually references to him, and they often talk about the computer game Prisoner's Dilemma. But all these artists, it's kind of like disciplinary silos. They're just totally unaware of anything outside their discipline. Okay? And one thing that this kind of suggests to me is it's not just that disciplines are isolated from each other, which we know, but disciplines, in Mary Douglas's words, create thought worlds. In other words, it's a thought world that's so complete that you don't need to find out what the other disciplines are doing. Well, I think we do. Okay, so let me start off with a very provocative statement. In a world without technology, collective action is unproblematic. It's just natural. Now, most of you, having some familiarity with the social sciences, will immediately say, what? Okay, because to say something is just natural, to naturalize it, places its explanation outside of society. Kind of naturalizing is kind of an original sin within the social sciences. But those of you who have a little bit deeper familiarity with structuralism will recognize that this is a familiar totemic trope. Totemism is the explanation of social categories in terms of natural species, as Levi-Strauss demonstrated. And totemism is naturalizing social distinctions. Okay. Now, from our critical distance, we recognize that totemism is kind of a cultural construction. But for tribal societies, totemic distinctions are, just natural. Okay. So, we actually are somewhat tribal sometimes. We naturalize many things and kind of impute natural distinctions to social phenomena. But my first step in this, saying that collective action can be just natural, is completely borne out once you get into the literature of totemism. But second thing, and this actually I've been taken to task by a few archaeologists because can we imagine a world without technology? Okay. Humans have been using tools for millennia, and even more. Okay. So why would I say that there was a world, a human-built world, without technology? Okay. Well, in fact, as I will demonstrate momentarily, technology is a modern idea. It's a modern coinage. In our society, it is a key word. You're probably familiar with Raymond Williams' keywords, where he describes technology as one of the core terms in our society. Or you might be familiar with Kenneth Burke's The Rhetoric of Religion, where he talks about God terms. For us, I would say technology is a God term. In other words, technology for us has a lot of connotations, a lot of references, a lot of associations that just demonstrably do not apply in pre-literate societies. So I feel very comfortable saying that yes, these sophisticated tools, I mean these are stone tools, and actually many pre-literate societies had very sophisticated tool assemblages. Marshall Solins tells about some Eskimo traps that sit in a closet in the Smithsonian because nobody can figure out how to assemble them. They were so complex. In other words, the instrumental assemblages of pre-literate, pre-modern societies can be very complex, but it doesn't quite make sense to apply the word technology to them. And I'll develop this idea. Really, the first usage of the word technology dates back to 1615, Oxford English Dictionary. Okay. But Bigelow's Elements of Technology is the first sustained development of the idea. And in the in the 17th and the 18th and the first half of the 19th century, technology was primarily writing about tools, the useful arts, and mechanical arts. It was not a class. We didn't talk about a sophisticated technology or something being given. Technology was a class of writing. Okay? In Bigelow's Elements of Technology, the first chapter is of the materials used in the arts. Okay? For him, that was technology. Core point here, this is a stake I will drive at the ground, is that applying the terms of one era to the cultural productions of another without recognizing the implications is ethnocentric. Okay. Louis de Montt developed this idea in his book Homo Hierarchicus and the appendix to it, Caste, Racism, and Stratification, where he argued forcefully that to call racial distinctions in modern society by the same word as the castes in South Asian society was a misappropriation. Okay? Because we have a modernist, individualistic, egalitarian ideology, whereas Hindu society, hierarchic, group-oriented, okay, and to apply their ideas of caste separation to our racial distinctions was completely wrong. Okay, and he developed this in Homo Hierarchicus. And just for a couple of examples, I mean, I've been fascinated by some of the social distinctions in colonial Mexico. You can go into some of the museums there and find charts of all the different social distinctions, about 20 different social distinctions, castas, morenos, mulattoes, etc. But these are not social classes. Okay? These are bound up in their own ideology. And similarly, I would say, a digging stick, a stone tool, might be very sophisticated, might involve a lot of craft skill in its production, but we cannot call it technology simply because we are applying our words to something where they don't apply. The connotative meanings of the word technology include power, scale, engineered content, sophistication, compressing lots of information and energy into a small package. And certainly in the 20th and 21st century, technology has some aesthetic implications. We have ideas about what technology should look like. The smooth package, the smooth surfaces, so that you don't see all the functionality. It's magic. Okay. And the anthropologist Alfred Gell kind of developed this idea of technology as contemporary magic. Okay. So just kind of recapping this history a little bit. As I said, the earliest usage of the word technology was in 1615, Bigelow's Elements of Technology in 1829. Technology became institutionalized, if you may, in 1861 with the founding of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now see, and this was from people in Bigelow's social circle. Okay, so there in Cambridge, there was kind of this intellectual ferment, as you know, that led to this institutional innovation. I mean, before this time, higher education was only concerned with the finer things, philosophy, literature, and any notion that we can teach the useful arts in a university. Okay. So MIT and roughly contemporaneous land grant act kind of really created a new institutional foundation for technology. We're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and we're creating a new class of instrumentalities. Instrumentalities that exist on a massive scale, that harness incredible amounts of information and energy, just unprecedented. Karl Marx said that the steam engine gave us the factory system and the working class. Well, if you look at the historical record, you will find sugar factories in the Caribbean in the 17th and early 18th century, 100 years before James Watt invented the steam engine. In other words, the causal sequence was the other way around. The factory system preceded the steam engine. Okay, so let me get just a little bit more analytic in terms of what's involved when we talk about technology. First of all, instrumentality, obviously. Technology is supposed to be useful. Is everything technological that we have useful? Hell no. And I'm thinking of some of Microsoft's programs, but we won't go there. Okay, but technology supposedly is about utility. But in addition to semantic meaning, technology also has poetic meaning of awesome powered skill. Now this distinction between semantic and poetic meaning also comes from Kenneth Burke, where he makes this distinction. Semantic meaning is about classification and ordering, and semantic meaning affords a truthness or a falseness. We can agree that this table is flat and does not have a curved surface. That's a semantic distinction. Poetic meaning, on the other hand, is about mood and engagement, kind of an attitude. Poetic meaning cannot be true or false per se, but rather it can be interesting. For instance, if I say man is a vegetable, well, that's semantically that's totally nonsense, right? But poetically, I mean, I think all of us know a few couch potatoes. So man is a vegetable in terms of couch potato as a poetic figure, a trope. Okay, is appealing. Okay, people talk about it. So technology has this poetic side as much as it has a semantic side. Okay. And actually, in another article, I kind of argue that the poetic meanings of technology are important, especially for assembling the user communities. We'll talk a little bit about the technological life cycle and how important it is for people to believe in the technology and to kind of form a critical mass of users. What leads people to believe in a technology, especially in the early stages, is not its semantic qualities, because sometimes these things just don't work, but rather kind of the promise, the poeticness of it. Okay. Another core feature of technology is scale. I mean, even if we're talking about a small device, okay, technologies exist on a large scale. This device is compatible with computers around the world. Okay. This is possible because we have some standards for these. Standards are a core part of technology. Having an agreed upon set of standards enables us to build these world scale systems. Now, earlier tools had standards, if I may say, but they weren't written. They were conventions. They were craft traditions. And for example, a master craftsman would have his own jigs, his own models, and he had his local tradition, and that created a local standard. And that works as long as you're just working in the locality. But if you're trying to do something on a monumental scale, such as the cathedral at Chartres, you need standards. And some of the earliest use of written standards, templates and jigs, was in the cathedral at Chartres. One of Henry Ford's greatest innovations was to take away the scales from his different craftsmen and say, okay, we're all using this one standard measure. In other words, Henry Ford imposed a standard on his workers, and that's what enabled him to scale up Highland Park Assembly. Okay. So, standards, representations, okay, at the core, but then we reassemble technology into these large-scale systems and large-scale network systems, implying some feedback, some regulation, whereas a network is just kind of a lattice work of meaning. But these systems give shape and sturdiness to state authority. Now, in the interest of avoiding accurate citation, let me give you my source here. Peter Fritschie, A Nation of Flyers. This is about aviation in Germany between the two world wars. The histories of modern nationalism and modern technology are inexorably intertwined. Far from diluting nationalist passions, once thought to be ancient and mean, industrial prosperity and rational purpose give them shape and sturdiness. And he goes on to say that aviation, perhaps more so than any other technology, exemplifies the relationship between industry and nationalism. Okay. That's all well and good, and that's the perspective from Germany, that's the perspective from the United States, but that's the perspective from the core. Some of our research, a dozen or so years ago, looked at aviation safety on the periphery. And I'm working on a book on this with a co-author in China right now on aviation safety issues in China. We developed this concept of technological peripheries. Okay? Because a technological periphery is some place far from the core. Okay, this core and periphery is Emmanuel Wallerstein, the modern world system. Okay. And here in the core, we have great infrastructure, we have the latest devices, everything's very whiz-bang, and works reasonably well. The further away you get from the core, the less that is the case. Our big breakthrough, and we had an international workshop on this about 9 years ago, our big breakthrough was to realize that although technological capability grows geometrically, and forgive me if I'm telling you things you don't know, that you already know, but you may not be familiar with Moore's Law. Moore's Law, a law of technological acceleration, states that the processing power of microprocessors and the memory capacity of transistors doubles roughly every 18 months. Exponential growth. He published that in 1965, 48 years ago. And guess what? It's held up ever since. The earliest devices in 65 were very, very primitive, but now we have gigabyte storage. I mean, that would be just unthinkable. Technological capability accelerates geometrically. It diffuses arithmetically. In other words, the spread of technological capabilities from core to periphery is a more gradual process. Now, this is just a model, and like all other models, it greatly simplifies things. But the dark side of Moore's Law is a growing technological gap between core and periphery. In the core, we have great institutions like the National Science Foundation. In semi-peripheral nations like Mexico, they have CONACYT, Consejo Nacional Ciencia y Tecnología, okay. And they're basically trying to adapt technology to their context. In peripheral nations, like Cameroon, for example, we had a scholar from Cameroon working with us on this. They don't have these institutions. They just do not do research. That's the nature of the perimeter. That's the nature of the. So greater and greater technological gaps in the world are part of the story of technological growth. Okay. Now here's my core point of this talk, the key thing. Okay. And this kind of pulls together all the pieces of the argument. Technology is embodied in large-scale structures like roads, aqueducts, cathedrals, and now broadcast networks and the internet, highways, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. In our society, we build these large-scale systems. Okay. The Romans had large-scale structures, aqueducts, for example, and Frontinus and Vitruvius described some of their large scales. Frontinus and Vitruvius, incidentally, could be seen as setting down standards for technology, because if you're building a road to facilitate the movement of the Roman army, you can't leave it up to local whim to decide how wide that road's going to be. You have to have a standard width. And that's one thing that Vitruvius talked about, is how wide should a road be. Okay, so standards are a few thousand years old. Okay. But when we had the Industrial Revolution, when we scaled all of this up, this created what I would characterize as an original relationship between humanity and its instrumentalities. Now, we can talk all day long about kind of the dynamics of the Industrial Revolution. I'm not going to. Okay. But we can observe that similar movements in the 19th century were going on all over the world. The May 4th movement in China, that's actually 1912. Towards the end of the 19th century in Mexico, a modernizing dictator, Porfirio Diaz, surrounded himself by a group of technocrats called Los Científicos, the scientists. Honest administrators. This was his way of breaking with the past. Let's put the scientists in charge. Just like Thorstein Veblen, a few decades later, argued for technocracy as a way of eliminating the corruption of government. And even in Russia, Lenin was a great admirer of Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor. Lenin said that, look, if we can just implement Fordism in Russia, in Soviet Union, we will become modern. Okay, now what all this has to do with society, okay, has a couple of dimensions. First of all, historically, truly up to the middle of the 19th century and even beyond, people who used tools and people who made tools were of a separate social class from the educated ladies and gentlemen. Okay. There was a strong class separation. Now, yeah, somebody like Jefferson might dabble. Jefferson was an extraordinary figure. Ditto Benjamin Franklin. Okay. But Franklin was a printer. He was a craftsman. Okay. Self-educated. Okay. And again, another extraordinary figure. But by and large, the people who made and used tools were not of the higher classes, because to work with your hands was considered beneath the dignity of a gentleman. That's what you had the help for. Okay. So in the 19th century, we're breaking this separation down with people like Bigelow and institutions like MIT and so forth. Okay. And we're creating new ways of talking about technology. Again, as I said earlier, historically, technology was craft knowledge, and it was often a secret of the master craftsman. You may have heard of medieval mystery plays. The mystery of the mystery plays was about the mysteries of the craft. This was carefully guarded knowledge. We're not going to publish this. But once technology escaped those social constraints, okay, we started creating representations of meaning. And one of the defining characteristics of technology is that it has autonomous representations. In other words, we can have the device, such as the clicker, and there's a document, or actually thousands of documents, that describe what this is all about, how it's built, what it's used, how it works, and so forth. Any technology has an autonomous representation. And that contrasts with, say, something that was built by a craftsman or a blacksmith. He knows how to build it. He has the knowledge up here. He's probably illiterate, so he doesn't feel a great need to write it down. Technological traditions are different from craft traditions. These autonomous representations create new circuits of meaning. They created the possibility of the rise of the engineering profession. Again, in the 18th century, any notion that engineers would rank up there with doctors and lawyers would have been thoroughly nonsensical. And in the late 19th century, as with engineering institutes such as MIT and Caltech, engineering became professionalized, and engineers were admitted to the company of ladies and gentlemen. Now, just a couple of my analytic tools, and those of you who have some engineering background will recognize some of this. Those of you who have some anthropological background will recognize a completely different side of this, because the title there, The Developmental Psychodomestic Technologies, is a direct allusion to Jack Goody's The Developmental Cycle of Domestic Groups, where Goody demonstrated that different family and domestic characteristics, different household characteristics, sometimes corresponded with just where they were in a developmental cycle. Well, technologies also have a life cycle. This is well known in engineering. Technologies go through stages of problem definition, and experimentation, early build, prototype, maturity, fielding, retirement, and so forth. That's all well known within engineering, although it's not quite so well incorporated in the science and technology studies literature. Interestingly, interesting point about this, in the later stages of a technology's growth, it can be deterministic. In science and technology studies, technological determinism is considered wrong. Partly because we struggle to demonstrate this technology is a social construction. The social construction of technology is a well-known school, as you're probably familiar. But mature technologies do acquire an autonomy, partly because we've invested so much in their configuration, in their standards, that we really cannot propose altering. We can just scrap it. So this whole notion of technological, social construction of technology, it presumes, at least in the earlier stages of a technology's growth, a certain amount of interpretive flexibility. And I'll give a couple of examples in the next slide. That in technology's early stages, we're not quite sure what it's all about. We're experimenting, we're playing around, maybe crashing a few, but figuring out what this thing is good for. But later, as the technology matures, there is a closure, and we all agree on what it's all about. But that applies primarily where the users and the developers are somewhat close. If you go to a country, say, like Taiwan, where I've done a little bit of my research, I mean, they were not involved at all in the development of the airplane. They essentially just had to accept airplanes and other technologies as mature technologies. Now, they're very smart and very resourceful, and they quickly adapted, but they could not impart their own characteristics to this technology. When technologies go from core to periphery, there's a process of translation involved. And translation is a wonderful double entendre, because those of you who know some physics know that translation is moving from one place to another. Those of you who know some languages know that translation is an alteration of meaning. Well, I intend both sides. technologies are translated from core to periphery, and on the periphery they face all over the problem of institution building. Now let me give some examples of this. Okay. Easy one, nuclear power back in the 1950s. Back in the 1950s, nuclear power was new, it was wondrous, thought it was going to be, quote, too cheap to meter. Have all this wonderful unlimited power. And that people believed that through most of the 50s and 60s. Then 1979, 3 Mile Island, 1987, Chernobyl, and now Fukushima. The bloom is off the rose for nuclear power. Okay? And so the problem of nuclear power now is not what do we do with all this unlimited energy, but how do we put it back in the bottle. But 50 years ago, 60 years ago, nobody could have possibly imagined. Now, if that seems like ancient history, let me get a little bit more contemporary. Walter talked about this workshop that I organized 18 years ago on culture, society, and advanced information technology. You know, sometimes in your life you get lucky with the timing, and this was probably my biggest piece of luck, because I'm having some discussions at the National Science Foundation, and a program officer, and this is, we're in 1993 right now, a program officer is telling me about this new thing called the internet. Now, I had an email account in 1992, so I didn't have anybody I could send email messages to. Who was the first idiot who had an email account? But that's how new it was back in 93, that we're just beginning to see what's. And this program officer who was in anthropology was saying, no, excuse me, in social science, was saying, shouldn't we be looking at the social aspects of the internet? And I said, of course. Okay. So we got together, I've simplified a story. We got together, some program officers agreed to launch this workshop on culture, society, and advanced information technology. We agreed on it all. This is in January of 95. The workshop was scheduled for June of 95. In between there, Mosaic was released. Now, some of you are old enough to remember Mosaic, the first graphical web browser. And there was a real buzz. Oh, this is cool. Look, can't you see this? Okay. Because before Mosaic, the internet and the World Wide Web was all text. No pictures, no images, all just boring text. And suddenly the fact that we could manipulate images, that was cool. So a couple months later, we had this workshop. But even then, we had a lot of argument. Is the internet just a pipe for information, or is it a new social space? And they were nervous about thinking of it as a new social. I'm talking about people in the National Science Foundation. They were nervous about thinking of it as a new social space. So that's why we call it culture, society, and advanced information technology, which could include CD-ROMs. Okay, because they did not want to really highlight the social aspects of it. But our report did discuss it. So that was in 95. Now, if I ask you now, well, of course the internet is a social space. Okay. But 18 years ago, that question was up for grabs. Another example, okay. The aeroplane. Okay. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, the airplane, just a bunch of crazy guys. Nobody really knew what this thing was for. Okay. And for many years, experimenters such as the Wright brothers and Curtiss and Blériot and so forth, they're just tinkering with airplanes. Okay. And nobody really took it seriously until the Wright brothers had this big demonstration at Le Mans in 1908 by illustration about the aeroplane flies around the world. That's the Wright brothers' first demonstration flight at Le Mans. Blériot was there, and when he saw what the Wright brothers could see, the Wright brothers controlled 3 axes of motion. Nobody else knew how to do that. And so everybody's looking up at the sky, they see this thing, and then it swoops hertz. We are all children of the Wrights. That was Uriel's words. They were so in awe at what the Wright brothers can accomplish that the news of it on the front page of Le Monde flew around the world. Now see, this is an autonomous representation. This is a circuit of meaning, the front page of Le Monde, that is separate from the actual physical device, and that is characteristic of technology. Now, final illustration here, let's just look at space travel for a second. We often think of the first landing on the moon in the 80s, Neil Armstrong and all that, but actually man landed on the moon in 1880 in Jules Verne's novel, From the Earth to the Moon. Okay. And that, again, Verne imagined space travel before we actually physically did it. And kind of figuring out kind of how what we do with this thing called space travel has been, well, shall we say, an issue ever since. I mean, some dreamers imagine commercial space travel. Nobody's quite worked out the economics of it yet, but there is still the dream out there. Just to kind of illustrate how space travel alters our perceptions of space and time, I can tell you just a little story of I was at some corporate event, this was like 30 years ago. Sitting at the table with me was myself, Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, respect, and Jim Lovell, the astronaut, remember, Apollo 13 and all that. And Mary Douglas is talking about a trip she had taken around, a cruise she had taken around the world, all the interesting places she'd seen. And we're all giving her a lot of paying attention. And then she looks up at Jim Lovell and says, "Have you ever gone around the world?" Well, he said yes. How long did it take you? 90 minutes. Completely warped. See, Mary Douglas was completely rooted in the 19th century traditions of colonial exploration. And Jim Lovell, very much a man of the 20th century. Okay. Now, the core problem that I'm wrestling with is what happened to create this new original relationship with our instrumentalities. Okay. I think it has a lot to do with European expansion and colonial exploration. And this state of nature and the idea of commons here kind of is the core of the rest of my talk. In the beginning, all the world was America. That's John Locke. And for John Locke, America represented the state of nature. And state of nature, untouched by human hands, you can appropriate. Now see, from John Locke's perspective and the Europeans' perspective, the Native Americans did not work. Okay. So it was okay to kick them aside because they didn't really work on the land. That's a European. I'm not endorsing that. Okay. But I would argue that the state of nature, the fictional state of nature, is always some other tribe's commons. Okay. The state of nature is a public good. And now I'm getting into Eleanor Ostrom, who wrote Governing the Commons. Okay. A public good that somebody is enjoying some benefit from. And if we take it over, we're denying them that benefit. So let me get into kind of the core intellectual innovations I'm making here. And that is the relationship between technology and common pool resources. Here's 4 examples. 4 examples. Okay, spectrum. Okay. Just, only 125 years ago it was discovered by Heinrich Hertz. Marconi developed the wireless telegraph. When radio communications interfered with the rescue of the Titanic, we passed the Radio Act of 1912, which regulated the use of the spectrum. But now, the spectrum has become an overcrowded commons. Okay. there's a scramble for what some people call beachfront property, which is those segments of the spectrum where the waves can penetrate building walls. Now, if you doubt that spectrum is an overcrowded commons, then you've never had a dropped cell phone call. Dropped cell phone calls are usually the consequence of too many signals crammed into too little bandwidth. Second example, all of you, probably this is foreign language to all of you, but all of you have benefited from this because we regulate the airspace. This keeps airplanes from crashing into each other. ATC controls it. In class alpha airspace, have to fly IFR. I'm throwing in those acronyms, and I've supplied a LOA, list of acronyms, okay? Because acronyms are the boundary markers of a technocratic society. Okay? And any airman is going to know what ATC is, but for the rest of us, it's just kind of gibberish. Okay? In other words, these thought worlds are bounded by, among other things, the acronyms. Okay, well, the Air Commerce Act was passed in 1927 and established different classes of airspace. Class B is above a big city, Class C is above a little city, and so forth. Okay. What's upset the balance now, here's a technological innovation, is flight management systems, computers that fly the airplane. And if you have a pilot in the cockpit and a computer in the cockpit, who's in charge? Well, there have been a few planes that have crashed because we didn't quite figure that out. In other words, technological innovation upset the equilibrium. Another example is the genome. Who owns your genes? I'm not saying G-E-N-E-S. I mean, traditionally would think of the genome as the common patrimony of humanity. Okay? And any thought that you could patent a genetic sequence would have been totally nonsensical. But then 60 years ago, Watson and Crick discovered the sequence, discovered DNA. 20 years later, we're mapping gene sequences and so forth. And so the whole question now is whether or not you can patent a gene sequence. I mean, this is a live issue within the course, right? But if that seems a little bit abstract, let's talk about something with else. Okay. Intellectual property. Who owns culture? Again, I would think of culture as a common patrimony. Okay. But in fact, especially in this century, culture is becoming more and more privatized. Okay. I mean, trademarks existed back in the Middle Ages. They were typically a maker's mark, but only in the 19th century was the legislation codified. The Copyright Act was passed in late 1920s. Okay. Mickey Mouse was invented, created, and copyrighted in 1928. But guess what? With the 75-year limit on copyrights, Mickey Mouse was set to go into the public domain 10 years ago. Big problem for Disney. So in the last 20 years, 30 years, lots of technological innovations. So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which criminalized a lot of activities that were just civil violations, extended the copyright, extended the Disney franchise for another 50 years. Again, an instance of technological innovation creating new boundaries. Okay, so concluding thoughts here is that technologies are epistemic devices. Technologies force us to think in terms of certain channels of thought. They are society-making assemblages because they create commons, they create public goods that we share, and we have to learn how to share among them, so build institutions. But technologies, as distinct from traditional tools, also have autonomous representations, new circuits of meaning. Okay. They force thought into certain channels, okay. And just my LOA here is kind of a little bitty illustration of this. Okay. But technologies involve classifying, evaluating, sense-making. They are a society-making project. But society-making, we have to really settle some boundaries. I mean, the whole idea of a technological drama, which the anthropologist Brian Pfaffenberger kind of developed, is that when technologies are developed, it's a dramatic process. And certainly the appearance of the internet and the contestations over the internet over the last 20 years have been very dramatic in terms of what you can put on it, who you who's going to control it. The big contest, this is one pretty much settled, but the big contest 15 years ago, was the internet going to be a many-to-many connectivity, or was it going to be like just broadcast, just like TV station broadcasting information of it? That's a social issue, but it also implies certain different infrastructure decisions, because if the downloads can go much faster than the uploads, then you and I are just passive recipients of information. And that was a live technological drama 20 years ago. Domain names, the GTLDs, the generic top-level domains. In the beginning, it was .com and .edu and .gov. Now, ICANN, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, has thrown it open, and there's many different places applying and creating their own top-level domain names. Okay. And one final example. Okay. No. I think I pushed on the wrong button. Okay, so social boundaries imply private appropriation of some sort, and technologies kind of create the need for social boundaries, possibility of social boundaries, the infrastructure of social boundaries, whether in cyberspace or even pharmacology. What can we put inside our bodies? What will the FDA permit and disapprove for sale as a medicine? Okay. So, in conclusion, sociology is about thinking together, and technology creates thought worlds. But thinking together also implies the possibility of thinking apart. That if you have your own thought world and I'm not inside it, then maybe that's pushing us apart. This is a very non-utilitarian view of value, because I'm emphasizing sociality as a value rather than individual enjoyment. But it also suggests a possibility of totemic identities. Technologies, as we know, are totemic objects, and possibly, I would suggest, technologies create the possibility of exclusive identities. The final thought. Levi-Strauss said that cultural differences are products not of the isolation of cultures, but of their interaction. This is in Race and History. Okay. So, is technology bringing us closer together or driving us further apart?
Questions, comments?
So, Alan, it seems that there's a bit of a paradox when it comes to thinking about technology and standards. Because certainly, and as you point out, standards preceded your defined technology in the modern era. But if you were, say, an Egyptian artist or architect working in the Middle Kingdom, you were working within a set of standards, artistic and aesthetic standards, that had existed for a very, very long time. I mean, the Egyptologist John Baines has demonstrated that this system of decorum persisted for 3,000 years with very, very minimal change. And it was clearly a set of standards transmitted from generation to generation, shared very broadly among what must have been a community of thousands of craftspeople. Mm-hmm. But when we're dealing with modern technology, we're not only dealing with issues of transfer from core to periphery, but we're dealing with a massive change in the pace, the technological changes within a lifespan. Any person, I mean, anybody who got a computer science degree in 1975, although computer science hardly existed as a discipline in 1975, but anyone who got a degree in computer science in the 70s, all of those standards became almost instantaneously obsolete. In fact, have become obsolete 3 or 4 times.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a problem with expertise in modern technology, and it's really paradoxical in that one is creating standards with the expectation that this will create consistency. But in fact, what standards do in the modern world, in a modern technological system, is simply create a system that you're going to commit to, but in fact are just going to have to abandon 10 years down the road several times during your profession. So I'm wondering how we can reconcile what's going on with the pace of technological change with what one would normally expect to be a force for consistency, namely standardization.
Who controls the standards?
Well, of course, that's
yeah.
the...
I mean, see, working in a software company, more than once I participated in standards discussions. And we kind of called these standards wars because there were typically, and actually this is probably a ripe area for some historian or ethnographer to look at, because we typically tried to have all the interested parties sitting around the table, okay, which meant you had your favorite, and you had your favorite, and you had your favorite. And we had to duke it out, figure out what was going to be the common industry standard. Okay. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Okay. But it was a completely indeterminate process. Now, if you were from IBM and I was from Little Bitty Wisdom Systems, you would have a louder voice than I would have, and more likely to prevail. But maybe as IBM's representative, you were the typical IBMer and not very innovative and original, and we could outthink you. So it was an indeterminate process. That's why Brian Poffberger called it a technological drama. Okay. Now, the problem of how standards evolve. I mean, some standards change very slowly. I mean, we've been using 110 volts AC for more than a century. Okay. Other standards, such as the graphical interface, evolve like that. Okay. And the only thing I can say is it is a very indeterminate process, because if you have a proprietary technology that you can convince the rest of us should be the standard, you're golden. Okay. You win. Okay. But if the rest of us feel that you're taking advantage, we could gang up on you and say, no, we don't want you to set the standards. See, these standards discussions are remarkably democratic. Okay. You know, there's louder voices, but we're all, and to participate in the standard, you have to be among an elite. You have to be an engineer. Okay. But once you're in the room, once you're sitting around the table, you have a voice just as much as the guy from IBM. Okay, so best I can say is that it is a creative process.
As you were saying that, I was immediately thinking about say, a modern standard like Windows, for example, where what began as like a graphical user interface, like you were saying, and it evolved and things, and then Windows began to change. It went from 3.1 to from 3.0 to 3.1, and then gradually Microsoft said, hey, if we do this and change it every couple of times, we can have a whole new revenue stream. So we're going to change. Now we got Windows 8. And it's now, and everybody's using all these varieties of Windows, and now Windows is now like the revenue stream that keeps that keeps Microsoft going. Because now you've got all these other windows going around, and now people are competing. Like, well, which graphical user interface will we use? Now it's on the web. Now it's over here. But what is keeping the revenue stream of Microsoft going is their Windows. Because then they had Office, and they had Office 4.1, and every time they kept changing the Office, there was another revenue stream. And I began to think about that as an engine, economic engine for them.
I would call that rent-seeking myself. I mean, sometimes I say that every time Microsoft comes out with a new version, it sets American productivity back. But I mean, I don't think in the long run Microsoft is going to win that war, because there's enough other alternatives out there, not the least of which is Apple. I'm more and more migrating over to Apple, and I use Windows XP because I consider all its successors a dog. Okay, so, I mean, I would say the problem with Microsoft is they don't know when to leave well enough alone. Yeah.
I'm thinking about technology and space, and you're going back to your argument that about using the Wallerstein framework, and how some places are connected and with this technology and other places are left out. And I'm wondering if there are challenges, empirical challenges to that framework. And I'm just thinking again of areas of the world that I know, Asia and China. And at some point it seemed like that technology distance was really growing, but then their technology reached this point. So now we have the smartphone, where anybody who has a cell phone can get on the internet. So, I study migrant workers in China, who are the poorest of the poor in China, or almost the poorest of the poor, not quite. But they're the pretty poor folks in China, farmers who go to the cities to work. And they all now have these smartphones, and they're on the internet. So I'm here in America, typing on my computer, doing my work, and up pops a construction worker in the central China. Zhihui, how you doing? What are you doing? Are you in China? Where are you at? No, I'm in America. Oh, did you eat dinner already? And I'm literally having an instantaneous text conversation with a farmer, peasant worker in the middle of China. And I have another student who went back to China to do research and wanted to look at the impact of the internet on political attitudes. And so she wanted to find a village where people didn't have access to the internet and give them that. And literally, this smartphone caused this huge problem about finding that pristine, untouched internet population. So I'm wondering, and with the global cities venture too, could you see? I see much more distance between rural communities on the Yunnan-Burma border and Shanghai than the distance between Shanghai and New York. So I'm just wondering how much the Wallerstein framework is really helping us, if there's a tipping point or a change with technology that technology has created.
Okay, two observations here. Okay, the other resource I would throw in here is Everett Rogers on diffusion of innovations. A smartphone is an end-user device, okay? And it fits many of Rogers' criteria for ease of innovation. It's ease of diffusion, excuse me. It's small, it's portable, it's compatible, fairly quickly figure out how to use it. Smartphones diffuse very quickly, but the networks diffuse more gradually. There's now with satellite networks, we can have the possibility of satellite communication all over the world, but who's launching the satellites? Who's controlling the satellites? Well, initially it was the United States, then Russia, the United States. China now is launching its own satellites. Taiwan has launched a satellite. Other nations are launching satellites. But who's setting the standards? Again, standard setting is still very, very much a core activity. So the individual device may diffuse easily, but the total assemblage less so, especially should I say, the brain or the controlling part of the assemblage. Okay. Now, the other thing I would mention about that, okay, I'm losing my train of thought here. Sorry. Yeah. It will come to me halfway through Professor Montaluce's question. Go ahead.
Well, it is interesting you finish by quoting Lévi-Strauss. I don't know if Lévi-Strauss would have accepted this zombie behind this technology. Let me say, the word behind your history of ideas, it is the word progress. Do you mean all the development mean progress? If it is, Project Source would have some problem, and his little book published between 55 and 58, Race et Histoire, Race and History for UNESCO, he denied that. And closer to us, Marshall Salins, with his book, Stone Age, said the hunter and gatherer, they were happier than we are. So what is your thought? Is it in filigrane, we would say in French? Do you mean progress?
Well, the simple answer is hell no. No, I definitely not. I mean, progress, especially the notion that progress is inevitable or ongoing or progressive, completely a modern idea. Okay, it's a modern thought world. Okay. But having kind of adopted this thought, then we're trying to justify it. And one thing that we can justify progress is through invention. Oh, I remembered the point I wanted to make about cores and peripheries. Cores and peripheries. Oh, I should mention, we are ranking. I have copies of my article here, if anybody wants to kind of dig into it. Cores and peripheries used to be just about geography, spatial distance, geodesics. Okay. Now they're more about social networks. Okay. And I have colleagues in Taiwan and China that I'm in communication with practically weekly because we have a fairly tight network, social network. On the other hand, I am completely disconnected from people in Tibet. Okay. Okay. I am almost as disconnected from people in Mississippi. Okay. Again, I mean, Mississippi supposedly is part of this core nation, the United States, but my own networks do not go that far. Okay. I mean, I have various friends around Detroit, but some Detroit neighborhoods I'm not well connected in. So it's core and periphery nowadays. Geography no longer matters. Social networks matter, I would say, even more.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was reticent to ask this, but I will anyway. Why is it so important to banish technology from the past? Why is that core to your notion? Because there's something very troubling about that to me. Does it mean you're sort of a punctualist or something like that? Because I see kind of a negation of a lot of perfectly good uses of the word technology and complexity in the past that I don't see distinguished by the boundaries of the definitions that you've created. I can think of exceptions.
Okay, well, I mean, I would agree that in the past there were large-scale assemblages, there were sophisticated tools, and I mean, Steve's point about the decorum of the Egyptians, I'll have to find out more about that. But what I would strongly argue would be that for us, here in the 21st century, the word technology has a whole host of connotations, okay, that demonstrably would not apply to the tools of the past. Okay.
So what do we call that stuff?
Tools. What's wrong with the word tools? I mean, now see, okay, every discipline has its own specialized vocabulary. And in archaeology, as I understand archaeology, technology means a distinctive tool assemblage. Okay, that's the archaeological definition of technology. Okay. But that definition is neither a congruent nor a superset nor a subset of how people today use technology. Okay, so what I'm saying is if we use this word technology to mean anything useful, if technology means anything useful, then a digging stick is a technology. I mean, we kind of had this whole discussion about the word culture many years ago. I mean, people were very imprecise about how they use the word culture. Culture means anything. If a word means anything, it means nothing. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is kind of be more precise, both in the meaning of a term, okay, and then how one analyzes it.
You were raising a question about space and time as one of your puzzles, and I was thinking about that not only because it's so much in like the current folklore of modern culture, from Star Trek to whatever, and the fact that sort of like the Chinese have just put a rocket up above to send a man to the moon now, I just saw, and it got me to thinking that what we are doing now with our technology is now become sort of like an object. It's now like a political race. It's become a kind of a way to grab hold of something and get control over something. And maybe I'm wondering if that's something that it always was. That technologies are kind of power of control.
I would say, I would very strongly support that. Because just as Roman walls and Roman roads were about power and control, so too monumental architecture is about, look at me, I'm all powerful. And roads, walls, monumental architectures were some of the earliest technological achievements. Okay, so, yeah, I mean, I contrast that to domestic implements. A spoon. Is a spoon technology? Nobody would kind of think. But a spoon is very, very useful. Okay. But when we think of technology, we have these other associations with it. Okay. And our idea of technology definitely excludes spoons.
You talk about how cultures of the past were more focused on the group itself, and a more modern culture is more individual focused. So, are you saying basically that technology has basically evolved to serve the individual basically, and just allow for more individualized action, possibly meaning that it is driving us apart?
I would not phrase it quite that way, but I would say that the utilitarian justification of technology makes it more difficult to negotiate the shared values. That, I mean, if a public good or a common pool of resource, we have to negotiate and agree on how we are going to share that. But if I have some technological device that lets me exploit it, maybe I don't even need to talk to you. So it makes, what I'm saying is technology, kind of, the justification of technology is very utilitarian, and that kind of is almost antisocial.